Hi everyone, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. So notando, I would like to give you the floor. If you may start with opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Firstly, to the organizers for inviting me, and to my fellow panelists on this very important topic. I want to just introduce myself. I'm Dr. Nondando Hadebe. I'm a lay woman theologian, Christian. I belong to the Circle of Women Theologians. It is such a privilege to be able to be here. I'm very much aware, I think, that the religion that I belong to, Christianity, is one of the drivers of transphobia, particular sections of the faith. And that is why in my introductory remark, I want to begin by talking about understanding the nature of religion. And I want to use Christianity as an example because it is the faith that I belong to. And I want to look at, I say to myself, when it comes to religion, there are always contentious issues that are involved. So I want to look at history and to use history as a way of understanding two trajectories within Christianity. The first trajectory, I'm going to use Black history to describe that one, because that's the only way I can describe it. This is a trajectory, and I wanted to introduce like Black experience within Christianity of slavery, apartheid, colonialism. So you can immediately realize that I'm talking about a trajectory within Christianity that produces discrimination, hate, dehumanization of people. And even saying that feels so strange, because religion, Christianity, you pride itself as being a religion of love. But the historical experiences speak for themselves. In 2018, I went to Benin to a slave port, and in the middle of that slave port was a church. So we are now talking about this kind of trajectory in religion where particular people are targeted. And in this instance, in the whole slave industry, it was Black people. And it was people within the Christian faith. And so the mechanism of how this works is that people will find a group to target for their own interests. And then they will go to the Bible, which is our sacred text, and they will arm themselves with scriptures that justify the dehumanization, the hate, the discrimination, the violence against that particular group of people. And believe me, they will find the text. For example, in terms of slavery, they can go to the New Testament and it says, slaves, obey your masters. So they can take that and say, look, the Bible says that slavery is okay. So this is one trajectory within my faith. And so we see this trajectory. So we have to know the mechanism. How does this work? Because it replicates itself time and time again. Firstly, a group is targeted, which is different from the group that is interpreting the text. And then they go to the Bible and they arm themselves with scriptures, as I said, that vilify, that justify the discrimination, exclusion, and violence against that group. They mobilize themselves and they make sure that this happens because they have the power and the money. And so we've seen that not only in the slave trade, in colonialism, and so this represents a trajectory of within Christianity that produces these kind of alienating theologies and beliefs that target a particular group. And we see that happening, even in the whole homophobia, transphobia, all of these, sexism, classism, all of these are driven by this kind of understanding, this kind of use of religion to oppress a group, to exclude a group. And so this is not a mystery. It is a historical fact that anybody can find in history. And that's why I was very intentional. I said, let's deal with history. Let's deal with facts, so that there really isn't any need for us to, to feel uncomfortable in the discussion. But that's only one trajectory. And often that trajectory, because it's sponsored by the powerful groups, seems to be the only one. But there are other trajectories, there are other voices within the same religion, which is Christianity. And so we find, and I want to pick up on two of those other different ones. The one that I like the most is when the oppressed people hijack that religion and make it their own. And they go there, like we have done as Africans, read the same text, encounter a God who is a liberator, who says that we are people of dignity, a God of justice, equality, and love. And we hijack that, we grab that for ourselves. And we use the same text to liberate ourselves, to create our own faith that affirms our dignity as a people. We have our own churches, we have our own liturgy, we have our own music, we have our own experience that affirms our dignity. And we had to do it ourselves. We had to carve out within that religion our own voices. We had to resist the religion that was given to us, the interpretations that were given to us, and say, no, these are not the only interpretations. They are coming from a position of power and invested interest. And in our experience, we are going to own it. We are simply going to help ourselves. We're going to take it. We're going to transform it. We're going to make it ours on our terms. And that's why the Christianity is flourishing amongst us, because we have taken it. And we, the oppressed, we experienced vilification from this trajectory, from this kind of interpretation of the biblical text, have liberated ourselves. And we are redefining this faith. And it's happening over again. You know, I'm also a woman theologian. And you can imagine how gender has also been hijacked by the proponents of this trajectory. And we as women, when we read the text, we also discover our dignity. We simply take it back. You really have to take it back, because they will not give it to you. They will continue to justify the exclusion, the violence, the vilification, the marginalization. So this is a very powerful trajectory that has a history in our faith, history of slavery, genocide, all kinds of violence against particular groups of people that are interpreted as different. So we need to understand the mechanisms so that we know that when we hear this, we know it's coming from a particular trajectory within the Christian faith. And we can predict, because they are very predictable in the way they act. Target the group, arm yourself with the Bible verses, push for discrimination and hate, and say all kinds of things. So we shouldn't be really surprised. We should expect that this is how it works. It has happened in history. And so we are not calling them names. We are not doing anything. We are just quoting from history. We are saying this is what has happened, and this is what is happening in this trajectory of interpretation of biblical text. So I'm speaking as a Christian within my faith, and saying from the multiple oppressions that we've experienced as Black people, that we have been our own liberators. We have taken back the faith. We have taken back spirituality so that we liberate ourselves. We allow ourselves to flourish within the religion of our choice. So I put that aside. And then I come to culture, because a lot of times you hear like people saying, no, Africans don't do this or that. But I want to talk about African cultures in the plurality, and to say that these issues of discrimination against any group of people raise a fundamental question, and that is, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean? Because these discriminations are saying that other people should not be referred to as human beings, that other people should not have the rights that all of us have. So when we come to African cultures, we know that to be human is to be humane. And the definition of a human being is relational. It is I relate, therefore I am. It is communal. It is about your relationships with other people, relationships of dignity, relationships of generosity and kindness and inclusion. That is what it means to be a human being. It has nothing to do with any other thing. You know, it has nothing to do with people's sexuality, their gender identity. It is a quality that everybody possesses, just like dignity is a quality that everybody possesses. So to be human is to be humane, is to be in relationship with others. It is to be interdependent. It is about the flourishing of all human beings in that community. So if we look at pre-colonial, societies, you will find, like you find, particularly in countries that have never been colonized, like in Botswana, if you go to a village, you don't find like sections where particular people are locked up or sections of this. You find an inclusive community where everybody, in their difference, is given a space to flourish. So the idea that there are some people who do not deserve the dignity, there are some people that need to be excluded, discriminated against, it just goes against the very core of Ubuntu, which says that you are a human by being humane, and there's nothing to do with other qualities, biological qualities that define, or any other difference. And it's so interesting because even when we come to sexual diversity, we find that in indigenous cultures, difference always created a space where that person could flourish, either as a spiritual leader or somebody else. So, a function that suits who they are. And so immediately that context and understanding of humanity is irreconcilable with discrimination, exclusion, marginalizations of people, not appreciating people for who they are. And so what am I saying? I'm saying that even when we hear the other voices in religion, in Christianity, we need to remember that there's not a single voice that can represent all of Christianity. There are multiple voices. There are multiple voices with differences. And in that space, oppressed groups have found themselves, have gotten in and taken back their dignity, taken back their right to be, to have all the access of spiritual resources. And so even when we come to indigenous cultures, pre-colonial cultures, these are cultures of inclusion. And so when we take the best of religion, the capacity to look at the dignity of another human being, that is at the very foundation of what Christianity believes, and other religions, that all human beings have intrinsic value. They have dignity, and that diversity is the norm. You don't have one vegetable, one fruit, one tree, one flower. There's diversity there. Even amongst human beings, we have different IQs, different eyes, different DNA. So why should there be areas where that diversity is not celebrated? And we need to be asking those questions. Who is driving this agenda of discrimination and hate and exclusion? Because it's not representative of the very ideals of those people who are pushing it. So what I'm saying is that there is an expression of religion that is inclusive, that is inviting, that treats every human being as with dignity, that stands up for justice. And we need to amplify that voice when we hear a different message that seeks to harm, that seeks to marginalize, that seeks to exclude, the voice of violence and exclusion. And we are saying that's not the only voice. It's there, and it will always be there. And once we know it, we remove the element of mystery and surprise. We already know what is going to be happening and the strategy that is used. But what we do is we take away from that voice the power to represent everything religion. We say there are other voices, there are other ways of being religious, and we give ourselves the power to create religions that work for us, that allow each person to flourish, to be who they are in this world. This is a home where everybody without exception should find themselves, should know that they are welcome. And so if need be, we will take that step and create those religions that affirm as a way of countering the dominant voice as well. So I want to, again, just to thank the organizers and to say that this are my introductory remarks as a theologian and as an African and as a woman, to say that let's build an inclusive space where no human being, where no one is ever excluded for any reason. This is our home. These faiths are ours. We can take them back. We can make them ours. No one owns the faith. No one owns God. No one owns love. No one owns generosity. These are gifts for every single one of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nontando, for those wise and inspiring words. So my name is Tony Krug-Ayabazigwe. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Interfaith Network. Our moderator is unable to connect today, so I'm going to take over, but I'm doing this on quite short notice, so I hope that you will all be gentle and generous with me. So, yes, thank you so much, Nontando. Thank you for being willing to be here. Thank you for those wise words. I think that we've heard you speak on a number of occasions, and you're always wonderful to listen to. And I think that in the context of the side event, what you're saying about claiming back our faith, about refusing to allow those who would wish to oppress or exclude us to determine what faith means to us, is so powerful and so valuable. Because, as you say, all human beings have intrinsic worth, and that's also what it says in our faith traditions. And so there's really no reason why we should continue to allow those who are in authority currently to have the sole right to determine what our faith traditions say and how we should understand them. I am not going to do 10 minutes of introductory remarks. If Ricky manages to connect later, then we will give her the opportunity. I am therefore going to continue with the program, and I'm going to ask our first speaker, Mark. I'm going to introduce him, and then I'm going to ask him to speak. Mark Kandolski, he, him, is a trans man, an LGBTQI activist from Russia, St. Petersburg. He's currently a board member of the European Forum of LGBTI Christian Groups and holds a position as the Eastern Europe and Central Asia coordinator. For the last 4 years, he has also been leading the St. Petersburg-based group for LGBTQIA persons of faith with different religious affiliations. Christian, he himself is Christian and Roman Catholic. Mark, can I hand it over to you to continue?
Yes, thank you, Tony. And I want to start with a little bit of background information about me and my experience, which will explain my point of view and position. I have been born to an atheist family and was baptized at 19 in the Roman Catholic Church, a church which is considered and in many ways is liberal and open-minded in Russia. It happened 7 years prior to my coming out as a transgender person. However, at the time of my baptism, I have been in a relationship with a trans person who too was Catholic, with the same gender assigned at birth as mine. So effectively, I was in a homosexual relationship, whether you accept our gender identity or not. Of course, it caused numerous problems and ultimately led to my partner leaving the church and me becoming an activist in the field of LGBTQI issues and faith. While I would be glad to tell you more about religions other than Christianity in Russia and the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, that is not my place to do so. And I hope that one day people from my region practicing those religions will be able to speak about their experiences, views, and troubles. Religious suppression affects people severely in mind, soul, and body. It especially affects those who suffered from religious-based violence. As our recent research showed, those people are much more prone to suicidal thoughts, self-destructive behavior, substance abuse, etc. But what is more important, those who can afford to be open about their transgender status or sexual orientation in their religious communities have the best indicators of well-being. And I want to put a special emphasis on sexual health here. As you probably know, the situation with HIV in Russia is bad enough to declare HIV epidemic. And back to the topic, those LGBTQI persons who are open in their faith communities are much more attentive to their sexual health. They test for HIV more regularly and generally practice safer sex, even more so than those who have never been involved in any kind of organized religion. Accepting, affirming, and supportive faith community is a very important factor for health and well-being. But how do we achieve this acceptance? Every religion is based on sacred texts, and some sacred texts seem to be quite hostile towards sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexuality in general. In Russia, as well as in many other countries, it is widely accepted that LGBTQI and religion, meaning Christianity, are natural enemies. But as you can see from what I've said before, it is not so. These two groups of people, two communities, both benefit when they're allies. And sacred texts can support this alliance if read correctly. Biblical literalism, which often goes hand in hand with religious fundamentalism, is an idea that the Bible has one meaning and can be read in one correct way. I must say that this is just impossible, since we're talking about not a single text, but a composition of texts created for over more than a millennium in several languages and in various cultural contexts. Earliest biblical texts were interpreted and reinterpreted, even in later biblical texts. And after biblical canon was established, it was, again, reinterpreted for millennia. But a religion lives only if it can change itself, adapt to emerging contexts, while preserving its core values. We have seen it throughout the history. The prime example being translation of Bible to emerging European languages, which was initially persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church, but however, nowadays every Roman Catholic can read the text in their own language and is encouraged to do so. And the same goes for gender identity and sexual orientation. Culture and dominant religion are always interconnected. Secular views on sexuality and gender influence religion and vice versa, constantly changing optics of those who practice religion, influencing how they read and perceive sacred texts. These optics can be deconstructed through, again, reading and learning. Another problem with biblical literalism is that it is always selective. We accept one passage and completely ignore others, the ones that contradict our message, our idea, or the ones we just do not like. When we speak, for example, about transgender experience, a prime example of this is a passage from Deuteronomy 22:5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination. Well, this ban is situated in the same chapter as the passage which prohibits wearing wool and linen together, as well as a law which demands to kill a woman who lost virginity outside marriage. These are laws none of us practice, I hope, and this is all valid only if we agree on the fact that transgender woman is a man putting on woman's garment. However, the Bible has many narratives affirming gender identity or deconstructing traditional views on gender, femininity, and masculinity. And I hope you will learn more about this further into our event. It is difficult to base your argument on sacred texts if you do not practice the same religion or are not of the same denomination as your opponent. Opinion of those who practice it will always have more weight in their eyes. Bearing this in mind, I often use another approach. I do not explain, but pose questions. A position of an inquiring and respective outsider is much more fruitful in this case. The questions can be very simple. For example, a person tells you that there is a commandment against transgender persons. They do that sometimes. So you can ask questions. Which commandment exactly? I have read the Bible. I encountered 10 commandments in the Old Testament, 2 in the New. And which commandment are you referring to? Explain this to me. You know more about this than me. I do not understand. This position should be respectful, and this is more challenging. Whatever we think of those who are literalists, fundamentalists, who are against us, they're all our fellow human beings. We might not like them, we might even fear them, but they deserve the same respect to their experiences and knowledge. Asking and not explaining is a way to both learn and teach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that very interesting discussion. I think that particularly the points you've raised about the ways that culture influences how faith traditions are understood and read, and what people focus on is really important. And I also think that the framing around asking questions, asking respectful questions in a way that forces people to think through their unconsidered understandings, that's a very useful strategy, and it's a strategy that we also use in our work. So thank you very much. We're going to go on now to Amar. Amar is an Indonesian trans man Muslim activist, a queer theology enthusiast with extensive experience within social activism, aiming to unpack queerphobic languages and challenge dehumanizing narratives in theology. In 2019, Amar co-founded the Jaringan Transgender Indonesia, which is the Indonesia Transgender Network. In the same year, he also published a booklet entitled Christian Islam, Progressive Interpretations of Gender Diversity and Sexuality, a guideline to understand human body and God. Currently is a steering committee member of the Coalition for Sexual and Bodily Rights in Muslim Societies. Amar, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, and also for Global Interfaith Network for initiating this very important conversation with such an amazing people. It's truly an honor. So now I'm going to present a topic today entitled Requeering Islamic Narrative. I will be sharing my screen. Okay, sorry. Yeah, can you see my screen right now? Yeah, okay. So before I start, I would like to share that I was born in an Islamic devoted family, and I used to be wearing hijab before I found out that I am a transgender person. So during the time of confusion, with the denial, I always thought, and I always heard that LGBTIQ people are the antithetical to religion, antithetical to society, and that we are against, against religion, we are against God's nature. And then when I started transition, I am privileged enough to meet with progressive faith leaders in Indonesia and also in global level that helped me understand and accept myself as a transgender Muslim person. So I see that people try to say we need to queering faith, we need to queering law, we need to queering politics, as if queer is something new that is not exist in our history. But when we dive into historical realities, and I speak about Islam in Muslim communities, I'm amazed that actually queer people have been here in Muslim communities, and they are even the Muslim scholars have a very influential role in the historical Muslim society. So rather than saying that we need to queer faith or Islam in this context, I always say that what we need is bring back that kind of realities, that kind of interpretation that is more accepting and embracing toward LGBTQ people. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to acknowledge that there is a huge gap between the text, context, and reality in Muslim communities. I think a doctor already stated before that religion should be the basis for compassion and for humanity and dignity. But in reality, we see a lot of people are marginalized because of their gender identity and sexual orientation. And the oppressor always use religion as the justification. So there is a gap here between, the text that saying religion is compassionate, but in reality, Muslim or religious people who are queerphobic, they are not showing that kind of compassion. And also by saying the gap between the text context and reality, I need to to bring the context of the text. Astonishingly, interestingly, that the text that Muslims use to justify their hatred toward queer people is actually the text that behind the text lies the context of the acknowledgement of diversity of gender and sexualities. For example, the text that I'm showing here right now, people always refer to this text, this hadith, or the Prophet Muhammad saying and doing to spreading Islam. People always refer to this text saying that, see, Prophet Muhammad kicked out mukhannaf. Mukhannaf is the term that it was used more than 1,000 years ago to refer to a person that biologically male but expressed in feminine way. We cannot say that this mukhannaf is a transgender or a gay, because of course there is a huge gap, it's a LGBTQ is the modern term, where mukhannaf is very classical term. But the text, the context behind this text, actually the acknowledgement that these mukhannaf used to be treated as women. Even these mukhannaf, or let's say queer people, or feminine boy, they are treated, they are given permission to be in the same room with other women. But because there was a precedent where this mukhannaf did verbal harassment toward women, that makes the Prophet Muhammad kicked his mukhannaf away from the house. So actually, this narration talk about the the statement against verbal harassment, regardless of our gender identity or our sexual orientation. But this interpretation is not mainstream, right? Because the political and the history and a lot of things, and the historical reality also clearly stated that homoeroticism already become become part of the reality in historical Muslim communities, even in the era that people consider as the Islamic golden age. The scientific discoveries there, and that was also the era where the diversity of human bodies were celebrated. Homoeroticism is there, and even the Muslim scholars wrote a lot of poems showing their attraction to another man. And you can this is one of the poems that I read from a book titled Fiqh Sexuality, or Islamic Jurisprudence of Sexuality, written by progressive Muslim scholars in Indonesia. Of course, there is a little resources on it, but it is there to state that homoeroticism is also already part of the Muslim community. And even in the classical books, it's are teeming with the queer existence, with the diversity of gender and sexualities. And it is already part of our history in Muslim communities. So it is actually countering. So it is actually countering, or neglecting the statement that queer-phobic Muslim communities always says that queer is the product of the modern, because it is not. We have always been here in so many spiritual, cultural, communities and societies in the world. So even in the Quran, of course, Quran doesn't say about LGBTQ people because LGBTQ is the modern term, but Quran does literally categorize the human bodies, even in one text and also in other texts actually. It is stated that there are people, there are male who have no physical desire to another man. Of course, there is diverse interpretation, but the text, a lot of texts, you know, stating what is it? That human being is created with a diverse identity, so that we can respect each other, so that we can be compassionate to each other, not to hate or alienate or criminalize other people, like what including gender identity and sexual orientation. So what we need is requerying and then redefining and how make it more mainstreaming in these religious communities, including in Islam communities. So I'm going to also show you the lessons learned from Indonesia. Of course, the context matters. What is working in Indonesia might not working in another country, but this is what we have been doing in Indonesia. We have actually several Islamic collective and organization and institution, casual institution that are welcoming and accepting queer people with the more inclusive interpretation and perspective of Islam. And also we have a lot of training. We knocking worshiping places door. We met with religious leaders to encourage them to be more accepting toward queer people. And of course, knowledge production is also one thing that we need to continue doing, because this is we are fighting against the narrative. So we also need to continue producing narrative that is more affirming and more compassionate toward queer people. So yeah, just to close my presentation, I have only a little time here. So we shall not consign our religious spaces to those queerphobic, those exclusive, and those conservative people and narrative, because I think the believers should believe that faith should be the source for strength, for love, for compassion, to restore our humanity, so that we shall not give up our religious spaces to those hateful narrative and you know, and people who misuse and misquoted religious texts to condemn and to hate other people. That's all, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omar. I think that you've just demonstrated absolutely so clearly why it's critical that we should read the text in context and not allow people to pick a verse or to pick a point and run with it without considering the background of that text or that verse. I also think that you've shown us very clearly that queer people have always been there, something which we know, but I think that many more mainstream religious organizations and individuals don't know that. So thank you very much. I also want to pick up on what you said about the importance of recognizing that, as Nontando said at the beginning, that diversity is the norm, and that in fact we are created in many and various different ways, and that they're all wonderful, and that is also recognized in our sacred texts. So thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm going to go on to Liberty. Liberty Matthijssen is the Executive Director of Gender Dynamics, the oldest registered trans-led and trans-specific human rights organization in Africa. Identifying as a trans non-binary woman, she, they hold a bachelor's degree, an LLB, and master's degree in law, LLM cum laude, focused on non-discrimination and marriage equality for transgender persons in South Africa. both from the University of the Western Cape. Liberty also holds qualifications in project management, leadership, financial management, and strategic business management from the University of Cape Town. She, they can be defined as a community-centered, critical thought, human rights, and social justice activist whose passion in fighting for dignity, equality, and freedom for trans and gender-diverse persons drives her dedication to achieving positive change. They are the author to a number of academic publications, critical thought pieces, and a self-published book, A Darling's Journey to Liberty. In her/their spare time, she enjoys playing tennis, writing, and painting in their rural hometown of Darling. Liberty.
Thank you so much, Tony. And greetings, everyone, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much to Amar as well as Mark for the wonderful presentations that you've given. I am just trying to share my screen on this end. Just give me 2 seconds. There we go. I'm hoping that everybody can see my screen. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation for me to present today, and also on this very critical topic of understanding how we are situated as queer persons within our faith communities in the different contexts that we exist in. I want to start off perhaps by reflecting on a recent Facebook post that I came across. And the post read, and this is a little bit triggering, it was very triggering for me, read some, and was written in Afrikaans, something to the extent of te veel moffies know wat die evangelie sing en preek, Here help ons. That is in my home language, Afrikaans. And in English, it translates into too many faggots that sing and preach the gospel, God help us. And I asked myself, what does this mean? What is this reflective of? And how would I feel if I was a young person that happened to read this on social media? And so a couple of things came to mind. And so for me, on the one end, it really meant that the right to worship God is exclusive to cisgender and heterosexual people, and that's a problem, that level of entitlement. Secondly, that to be proudly LGBT, identifying and Christian are mutually exclusive concepts in the minds of many people. Thirdly, that hate speech can be justified if it means that you are defining or defending rather your religious beliefs and of course God in that particular instance. And so ultimately it also dawned on me that if that is some of the interpretations that I am having, and of course that what type of foundation is this in setting for what we know to be an anti-gender ideology movement globally, to be able to tap into already prejudiced ways of thinking at a community level. And of course, these particular issues does necessitate a particular intervention. So in looking at the impact thereof, I think that for me, it was also critical to understand the deeper context and the historical context that we are working with. And so it is important to know that as people, our actions are aligned to our beliefs about the world. And of course, our beliefs about the world is a consequence of what we have learned and what we have been taught about the world from a very young age. We need to question who has been the teachers and who has been the ones that have been subjecting us to learning processes. And I think for me, what is also very much important in that consideration is in looking at the pre-colonial past stories of Africa, and then Soviet Amalia's work around sexual and gender diversity never having been condoned within African societies, but also it was never actively condemned within African societies. Can you just give me 2 seconds? There's a little bit of disturbance at the back that I just want to address quickly.
Sure, Liberty. Maybe we can read the slide in the meantime.
Apologies, everyone. That is the joys of working from home. And my biggest fear that happened, that somebody was going to go to the kitchen and do something when it's my time to present. So apologies for stepping out for a few seconds. So in speaking to the pre-colonial context then, and the work of Soviet Amalia, I think that there's the important academics like Vasureri, Soraya Monroe, and Zetu Matabeni that has also extensively written in a book called Queer in Africa, that African non-heterosexual sexual identities and gender diversities are neither static nor uniform. And it plays on how we understood sexual and gender diversities in the pre-colonial context, where it was very fluid. And of course, people had different ways of being that wasn't as rigid as what we've come to understand it today. And so it brings into question then, of course, how values and principles were shaped at that particular time and how it has now been, how it journeyed through time to where we are at now, and also to some extent manipulated and augmented. And here we find that one important principle that we oftentimes try and defend and work with, and Dr. Ntanda spoke about this earlier on, which is really around Ubuntu and the principle of promoting compassion, harmony, humanity, and dignity, and how there's this play on African traditional values that we are seeing in the African context, where promoting African traditional values means the exclusion of LGBT identities and expressions. And so in looking at the pre-colonial past, it's also very critical to understand then how colonialism disrupted ways of being, and of course, how the church has been used within our context as an instrument to maintain oppression, and of course also to validate violence in many instances. And that the faith-based stigma, discrimination and violence that we are seeing today is actually then an outcome of that very colonial history. And of course, the next question that we ask ourselves is, how do we then locate the church's role, the church as a colonial structure within our context, as an opportunity then to be able to advance inclusion, advance respect for diversity, but also to some extent then harmonizing it to our pre-colonial context on this particular context. I think it's also very much important to look at the role of neo-colonialism at this time and how it curtails our ability to draw from a pre-colonial history as a positive template, so to say, to be able to build inclusive contemporary realities for LGBTQI+ individuals. And here we need to be able to look at and speak back to the role of the conservative right wing and religious groups that we can see are forging alliances, are funding particular interest groups, and particularly those affiliated to faith-based communities within the African context in order to implement a very oppressive agenda, an agenda that counters women's rights, an agenda that counters trans rights, an agenda that counters queer rights, as some examples. And we know that we are but one community or a few communities that's targeted at this particular point in time to be able to drive a bigger agenda. And the church is being used as that platform to gain momentum, to build a particular base in order to ensure that these leaders are able to get access to political power, and then of course be able to shape oppressive laws and policies against the very communities that we need to include within the diversities across Africa. And so in terms of looking at a big practical question then that I'm grappling with, just looking at that Facebook post that I spoke to a little bit earlier on, is then what would it take to reconcile faith institutions with communities it has hurt and it has harmed? And there's an acknowledgement that needs to be made there. And so what would it take to shift the statement that I spoke to earlier on, too many faggots that sing and preach the gospel, God help us, to shift it to so many diverse and queer people singing and preaching the gospel, God is good. And I know that that is a very simple example to make, but it also plays on our imagination in terms of what could be possible, where we are not necessarily only tolerated for the purpose of inclusion, but also celebrated and actively affirmed for who we are with our communities in spaces of worship. And so in moving forward, there is a couple of things I think that would be relevant for us to work with as a starting point in order to shift the status quo as we see it today. And the first one would be to recognize that language in our context is an issue. Africa is a very vast continent, very diverse continent. There are different ways of understanding, different ways of articulating. And so how do we root our way of speaking, our way of connecting to indigenous ways of being and local ways of being that connects with our communities, so that it doesn't sound like a foreign Western way of articulating sexual and gender diversities in a way that is not relevant within our communities. Secondly, it is also important to create enabling and safe spaces for dialogue to emerge within faith communities, amongst faith community members, and then of course to shift hearts and minds and forge solidarities to recontextualize and recenter the meaning of African values, not in alignment to the purpose of exclusion, but in alignment with the purpose of radical inclusion. And so we can play here on the work of liberation theology and what role that has played for oppressed people. And we know on the African continent, we have faced racialized oppressions within our different and ethnic oppressions within our different contexts. And often Christianity has been used as a tool to maintain and promote that. And so how do we draw from that with Black communities, the communities of color, in order to land that in essence, intersectional exclusion, stigma, discrimination, and violence affects people differently, but it's still the same. And the impact thereof lands the same. How do we use the possibilities brought forth by feminist theology around the promotion of women's inclusion within faith institutions as a baseline from which to mobilize a queer type of theology that recognize that now it is not necessarily only Black and colored people that are excluded, and women that are excluded, but also another type of community, which is LGBTQI+ people that's excluded from worship to worshiping spaces and communities. Thirdly, it's really around supporting programs that educate religious leaders and faith communities around these different forms of interpreting. And some of the my colleagues on the panel have spoken to that. Fourthly, it's really around holding faith institutions and faith leaders accountable for how what is being preached and the stance being taken within churches, as an example, translates and contributes to the high levels of hate crimes that we often see within the African context, and particularly within the South African context. And so being very clear that there's an accountability that they need to carry in what they say in those contexts and how it translates within the broader community and society. And then lastly, I think that it is important that we execute leadership and coordination to monitor and disrupt that which I spoke to earlier on, the influence of right-wing, anti-gender, anti-woman, anti-trans, and anti-queer groups that is using the church and faith-based communities as an opportunity from which to mobilize. And that disruption can come in the form of how we're monitoring resourcing and, of course, opportunities that they are getting in order to promote their particular agenda. I'm going to park it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Liberty. That was really interesting. I think perhaps especially the point that you made about how the church is used as an instrument to maintain oppression, both in the ways that it provides easy points for people to hang their prejudice onto, but also in the ways that anti-rights actors from outside, from the US, wherever, are using African iterations of the church as instruments to mobilize and gain momentum in order to maintain an oppressive stance. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I am going to go to Isikeli now. Isikeli Vulavu is a development professional with over 15 years of experience as a human rights activist and defender for LGBTQI rights and equality and key populations affected by HIV in Fiji and the Pacific. Isikeli uses gender-neutral pronouns, Z here, and identifies as genderqueer. Z is the current Chief Executive Officer of the Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network, a regional network of LGBTQI networks and organizations from around the Pacific. Isikeli is also the founder of the Rainbow Pride Foundation, which is an LGBTQI-led organization in Fiji. Z was the lead convener for 2 Pacific human rights conferences on SOGI that were held in I'm so sorry, my pronunciation, Nuku'alofa in 2015 and in Nadi in 2018. Here is well versed with the development issues affecting the LGBTQI community in Fiji and the Pacific and represents the community group at various high-level policy decision-making spaces. Isikeli has about 20 years of cumulative program management experience at the national and international level with specialities in gender equality and social inclusion. Isikeli, I'm handing over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Nissan Bolobinaka and warm rainbow greetings from Midnight Suva. I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender in the Pacific and also a little bit about Christianity. And then I will tell you a story about our journey as Rainbow Pride Foundation working with faith-based organizations in Fiji. Many cultures in Oceania acknowledge the genders beyond the biological categories of woman, female, and man and male. And in fact, it is common in many Pacific places for some biological males to take on typically female characteristics, effects, and roles, and for some biological females to take on those typically considered male. While this is often described in English as transgenderism, these roles and identities, and for some biological female, these roles and identities in indigenous Pacific conceptualizations might be better described as gender cultural identities that do not constitute a third gender category, as it has sometimes been reported, but more so represent a spectrum of expression and identity. Okay, and these gender cultural identities share common characteristics across Pacific Island countries, and yet they are also distinctive and unique to place. And importantly, these gender cultural identities and articulations continually change and adapt to forces such as missionary activity, colonization, modernization, and globalization. Okay, and just as expressions and interpretations of gender differ across Oceania, so do the labels and the markers used to identify and describe them. In fact, in many Pacific Island cultures, they have indigenous or localized terms, roles, responsibilities, and concepts that apply uniquely to people who identify as other than exclusively man, male, or woman, female. Our language can also be an important clue to understanding the complexity of cultural traditions and the influences of modernity, exchange, missionization, colonialism, and globalization as they relate to gender categories and identities. In fact, the terms that describe the wide range of gender identities in Oceania reveal how various societies view or name certain social phenomena, even as they ignore or hide others. Okay, and these words can also provide insight into the confusion and blurring that takes place today between the gender and sexual orientation. And in some Pacific cultures, for example, terms that are customarily used to refer to gender cultural identities are also now used interchangeably to identify or describe individuals who desire or have sexual relationships with people of the same sex. Okay, and while unique expressions of these gender cultural identities vary across Oceania, these identities are also accepted and highly respected social category in many Pacific societies, and particularly in Polynesia. Generally speaking, that this gender cultural identity, individuals who are biologically male live their lives as women, behave like women, and embody both male and female characteristics. And so there's some discrimination exists towards them, particularly when it comes to choosing their sexual partner. They are, for the most part, widely accepted and even celebrated in contemporary life. And despite the widespread acceptance of gender diversity and various kinds of intimacy between same-sex individuals in pre-colonial Oceania, colonialism, missionary activity, and other influences seem to have rendered third-gender males who dress or live as women the most visible examples of gender diversity in the contemporary Pacific. Okay, and in contrast to men who identify as gender cultural identities feminine, biological women who identify as third gender masculine tend to remain on the margins of society in most Pacific places. Okay, and Christianity has been integrated into indigenous Fijian everyday practice, belief, and social institutions to the extent that it can be seen as a significant means of constituting indigenous Fijian subjectivity, and that is that Christian belief and associated practices act as powerful aspects of what it means to be indigenous Fijian. Okay, and the most significant intertwining of Christianity and indigenous Fijian life has been through the colonial history of the Methodist Church in Fiji, which was from 1835 onwards, particularly through the integrated concepts of Vanua, land and people, Lotu, which is the church, and Matanitu, which is governance or government of the Bowen chiefly system. Okay, and these Methodist missionaries incorporated indigenous Fijian origin narratives into theology. Okay, and the notion of our tribal gods as the head of the Fijian pantheon of gods and the establishment of the Wesleyan Fijian district was successfully woven together by these missionaries. Okay, and the integration of this Wesleyan Christianity into indigenous Fijian worldviews was dependent upon the colonial relationships which with existing the chiefly hierarchy, particularly the highly political conversion of our main chief at that time that ceded Fiji to Great Britain, and this was influenced by the impact of colonial administration on the concept of Vanua. Okay, and through those integrated concepts of Vanua, which is land and people, Lotu Church, and Matanitu, which is governance, the Rainbow Pride Foundation had found an opportunity to, I don't want to use the term penetrate, to work with faith-based organizations, particularly with the Christian churches, to try and change some of the experiences of LGBTQI people within the church and also outside the church. Okay, and in 2016, Tropical Cyclone Winston, a Category 5 cyclone, had hit Fiji, and we did a study to collect the stories of LGBTQI people who were affected by Tropical Cyclone Winston. And most of the narratives that we collected from LGBTQI people was related to how people around them were blaming them for the disasters, for all the bad things that were happening in Fiji, which included tropical cyclones and lately COVID-19. And to make it worse, our first index patient was also a member of the LGBTQI community. Okay, so recognizing this and also using our own networks within the church. Okay, I grew up as a Methodist. Both my parents were Methodist. They were very religious. Both of them, unfortunately, have passed on. I used the network of my personal relationship with our Reverend, with the head of our church, who was on his way to lead the Methodist Church in Fiji, to open the door to LGBTQI people within the Methodist Church, which is the main denomination, which is the major denomination in Fiji. Came through our personal relationship and engagement with the Reverend of our church, we were able to organize a few of our events within the Methodist Church, and this was the stepping stone to more collaborative efforts between the two organizations. And recently in 2019, we were able to hold the first ever consultation or dialogue with the Fiji Council of Churches in Fiji after 2 to 3 years of pursuing them to open the door to us, to allow us to have a Talanoa, just a dialogue with them, to share with them the experiences of LGBTQI people in Fiji and how they can assist us to address some of those issues. Okay, and we were able to develop an action plan, a MAST, called the MAST Action Plan, after our dialogue, where we had listed down the strategies and a list of activities that we would like to do together to try and change the way the church treats us. And our ultimate goal is really to ask the church to change, to help us transform some of the gender and social norms that are harmful for LGBTQI people, not only LGBTQI people, but women and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. And through this engagement, we have been able to produce together a number of publications, one of which is Stories from the Margin, where we collected stories from members of the LGBTQI community on their experiences inside the church, the exclusion that they felt in the church, because this was something that the faith-based leaders had asked us to collect, to really appeal to the hearts and minds of the people of faith-based communities in Fiji. And we also, like I said, we have a mass action plan or declaration where we had listed down all the activities that we would like to do together. And we also were able to develop a glossary, a Sojiesque glossary. They needed some of the Sojiesque terms to be converted into vernacular to help them have those conversations at the grassroots level. Okay, and there are many other opportunities, and we are hoping that going forward, we will be able to work with Jin Sogi and the Rainbow Faith and Freedom in Canada to implement jointly some of the activities and some of the ambitions that the Fiji Council of Churches have developed jointly with the Rainbow Pride Foundation.
Isikeli, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah.
We're kind of...
I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was very interesting, and particularly the ways in which the relationship between the church and colonialism, or the church and indigenous culture and colonialism, really need to be complexified. It sounds as though in the context of the Pacific, some of the ways that things have happened in other contexts didn't quite work like that. Also very interesting to hear about the work that Rainbow Pride Foundation is doing with the Fiji Council of Churches. So thank you very much, Isikeli. I'm going to introduce the Reverend Alexia Salvador. We are going to hear from her through a video, which we're going to play. She's speaking Portuguese, and there are English subtitles, which is why we're doing it like this. She is, however, here with us, so she will be available to answer questions afterwards. The Reverend Alexia Salvador is a reverend for the Metropolitan Community Churches, being the first trans priest in Latin America. She is the vice president of the Brazilian Association of Rainbow Families, having been the first travesti to adopt in Brazil. She holds a bachelor in education and pedagogy and works as a teacher in early childhood education in the public education system in Brazil. As a theologian and priestess, she builds a militancy recognized throughout the country for fighting religious fundamentalism with its own transgressional existence, claiming the Christian faith as a possibility to overcome oppression and violence. She is married and mother of 3 children, 2 of them transgender. Javid, can you take it away?
Yeah, just a second.
We can't hear the sound.
Okay, I just a second. Yes, now I apologize.
Olá, eu sou a Reverenda Alexia Salvador, da Igreja da Comunidade Metropolitana. Sou uma travesti de 40 anos e sou brasileira. A fé é um elemento importante na vida dos seres humanos. Desde todo o sempre, a humanidade sempre buscou acessar o sagrado, o divino, o místico. Para muitas pessoas, a fé é um elemento essencial e indissociável. A religião tem, ou deveria ter, o papel de reconectar as pessoas, de fazê-las pertencentes a um grupo, a uma família, a uma comunidade. Essa é uma característica humana. Entretanto, a realidade nem sempre foi assim. Ser a primeira travesti reverenda no Brasil mostrou ainda mais para mim como o fundamentalismo religioso na América Latina tem crescido a cada dia. Ainda somos perseguidos e mortos. O Brasil é o país que mais mata travestis e transexuais no mundo. Todos os dias, ao menos uma pessoa trans é assassinada com requintes de crueldade. E talvez as pessoas podem se perguntar: o que o cristianismo tem a ver com isso? Eu respondo: uma leitura bíblica feita de maneira literal e descontextualizada gera estruturas colonizadoras e dominantes. O Brasil, que é o maior país cristão do mundo, é um exemplo de como o fundamentalismo religioso pode perpetuar sistemas de opressão e morte. Esse reflexo vai ser visto nas estruturas familiares, políticas e sociais, afetando diretamente tudo aquilo que está fora dos conceitos de normalidade e moral. Historicamente, o cristianismo nunca foi um lugar seguro para a nossa comunidade. Ser uma travesti clériga implica em despertar os ódios dos doutores da lei, dos fariseus, dos vendilhões do templo. Para nós, pessoas LGBTQIA+, essa violência vai começar dentro de casa, na família, lugar este que deveria ser o lugar mais seguro para o nosso desenvolvimento. De todas as letras da sigla LGBTQIA+, as travestis, homens e mulheres trans são as mais vulneráveis. Na maioria das vezes, somos expulsas de casa ainda na adolescência, sendo levadas à prostituição de maneira compulsória. Essa realidade de dor e de morte poderia ser bem diferente se a religião compreendesse gênero e fé como algo inerente à condição humana. Essa realidade reflete a falta de oportunidades e de igualdade entre as pessoas. A formação acadêmica não acontece porque não se consegue permanecer na escola. E não permanecer na escola é não ter oportunidade de estar no mercado formal de trabalho. O acesso à saúde, à harmonização e às cirurgias ainda é um desafio para pessoas que são vistas como marginais e sem direitos. Pensar em políticas públicas que combatam o extermínio da população trans é uma realidade urgente. A sexualidade não pode mais ser usada contra a natureza humana. Não podemos mais achar normal discursos de ódio vindo de lideranças religiosas, perpetuando de geração em geração um estereótipo de não pessoa, de não gente. Não podemos mais permitir que as futuras gerações vivam essa realidade. O parlamento não pode mais usar o seu espaço de poder e de decisão para legislar a vida e o destino da comunidade LGBTQIA+, como se fôssemos o câncer do mundo. Como uma travesti reverenda, eu compreendo a fé como detentora de toda a vida humana. Todo discurso de ódio, perseguição e opressão está na contramão do sagrado, do divino. A promoção da dignidade é o pilar de uma sociedade que compreende o diferente como normal. Que possamos continuar resistindo e sendo, mesmo em meio a tudo aquilo que comunica morte, retirada de direitos e segregação de corpos. Que possamos ser religiosos comprometidos com a autoafirmação das nossas sexualidades e das nossas identidades.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Muito obrigada. The self-assertion of our bodies, our identities, our faith traditions. I think that was a powerful call to hold religious leaders, governments, politicians accountable when they use our faith traditions against us. Thank you very much. I am now going to introduce our moderator, who has finally managed to join us. And then I'm going to ask her to speak for a little bit. And then after that, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So, Tsepo Riki Kosita Kanza's background is in international relations with a speciality in international human rights law and diplomacy. She is currently the Executive Director of Accountability International, whose work is to hold leaders accountable for human rights internationally as well as continentally, policy, health, and developmental commitments as a way to increase accountability towards marginalized communities. She is passionate about legal and policy reform within the region to advance socioeconomic justice and accountability. Amongst many of her achievements and roles, she won a constitutional court case seeking legal gender recognition in the High Court of Botswana in 2017, and continues to use strategic impact litigation wins to make legislative and policy gains. And I'm sure that she is going to tell us also about her experience of faith. Thanks, Riki.
Thank you so much, Tony, and good day to everyone. To all the esteemed panelists who have been having a pleasure of listening to. Thank you so much for bearing with all of us as we have, as Liberty was saying earlier, have had to adjust to working in these very ways where technology and even electricity at times can be a disappointment at the best of times. So my apologies, it is in no way a reflection of how I treated today. I was ready and I was connected. But thank you so much to Tony and the team at Jinsogi for being able to step in that regard and be able to continue the work going. So it's been a pleasure to actually listen in on all the various conversations, more so that I've also been privy to the moments leading to this very event in and of itself as we prepared, also unpacking what each one of the great experts who sit on this panel we're going to be bringing forward. And as a way of not necessarily doing justification to a summary of what has really been, I think, powerful insights that have come from our speakers, which I would have had the pleasure to be able to engage more with, but it has been beautiful listening to, for instance, Mark having opened for us and really just speaking about the need to be able to continuously amalgamate and integrate religious freedom into all the other civic and civic freedoms and liberties that ideally we continuously are fighting for the dignity and the full rights of every single person. What is particularly important, I think, is to continuously listen out for the nuggets that have come, I think, across all of the speakers that are speaking to the importance of ourselves as queer persons of faith, being able to really understand our own religious scripture and other religions as a way of being very intersectional in terms of our engagement with faith, with spaces of worship, as well as with religious leaders. And I think it was important as well in terms of what Mark was charging us with, to be able to continuously deconstruct scripture in such a way that we ourselves not be on the receiving end of various other people's own interpretations that might be exclusionary and discriminatory, and charging us with the level of agency to engage with religious texts so as to be able to strengthen our own advocacy around using religion and using faith and spirituality as reconciliatory vehicles and restorative agencies that we can be able to use in continuously building cohesive societies that are safe and celebratory of all persons that inhabit them. Basically, I really was charged. I think a lot of what you speak to is the work that really goes towards speaking to changing hearts and changing minds, which is really, really important work that I think all of us are engaging on, particularly using the medium of religion and faith, which otherwise in various contexts has been used to discriminate, has been used to violate and ostracize. And I think there's a lot that we definitely can be able to learn from the Fijian heritage, from a decolonial perspective, that I think both Amar and Liberty speak very strong to, particularly around queerifying scripture, around queerifying and even decolonizing religion and practices that are contained within various denominations that we subscribe to. And I think that is really, really important. One of the very fundamental reflections that I continuously have, more especially as somebody who is also Methodist by denomination, and currently pursuing a Bachelor of Theology as a means of my answering towards a call in ministry within the Methodist Church. So I'm currently busy with that degree, and engaging more and more with our religious scripture. I was very charged as we were preparing to want to engage with Reverend Alexia a little bit, and even with all the other colleagues and theologians who are here and academics who are in the space, around continuously, from a very Christian perspective, which is the faith I subscribe to, that I would want to bring in here and nuggets of inclusion and of celebration and of diversity that I think come out strongly. When you go into the books of Genesis, for instance, Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50, where we follow this narrative of Joseph, who was the son or the child of Israel, whom we are not told in much detail in terms of what their orientation was or what their actual gender identity was, but we understand the performativity of the gender that David actually embodied in a social context. You get to see a narrative of a parent in the sense of Israel, who was able to see a certain uniqueness in their own child, who was able to embrace that difference to the brothers that existed, who were much more masculine, where then Israel created this very feminine, very regal, very ornate kind of code for this very child who was male assigned. And in so doing, you get to see, as you follow, the trajectory of a God that used this very queer character to be able to provide the providence that God wanted to provide for the people of Israel as they came into Egypt during the famine that had struck Egypt and the adjacent lands at the time. And from that, we continuously can be able to see this very nuggets of God speaking, of God doing, of God using even queer persons and queer narratives to continuously be able to actually provide for others, to be able to provide social justice and provide change, and to be able to actually deliver on the grace that is needed. And I think when we connect that back to the level of accountability that as Accountability International, we're forever demanding of various leaders and various entities. It is important that we also go deeper in unpacking our own African values and our African ethos. And I think Nontando in their opening did a very fantastic job at speaking about diversity being the norm. And I've said this in many spaces as well, where we often find and hear of ourselves speaking about ourselves as non-normative, speaking about ourselves as non-conforming, and question becoming, what is it that is to conform? What are we conforming to? Because the point is that we're conforming to something that is seen to be the norm, that is seen to be right, that is seen to be good, that is seen to be the one that is more hegemonic or dominant. But when we go back and we unpick the religious scripture and we begin to see the different ways in God has created humanity, not only looking at cisgender bodies, when you're looking at eunuchs, for instance, within a biblical context, when you're looking at the same-sex relation and love that existed between King David and Jonathan within the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, these are very powerful narratives that exist that I feel strongly that as civil society, as queer people of faith, as queer people who are called to ministry, it becomes important for us to be able to continuously foreground these kind of texts that continuously show us a God that embraces diversity, that actually is a lover of diversity, dare I say, because that's what I often call God. That's what I often call God. And in that essence, we begin to be able to equip ourselves and empower ourselves to be able to actually flip the narrative and to change the discourse insofar as being able to be at the table and be able to speak at the same level, with the same kind of language. With that, I know that I'm also supposed to have been able to open up for discussion a little bit with some questions that have been placed for our esteemed panel for today. And mine was just to be able to come in and share a little bit of my perspectives that we had also engaged with everybody from Liberty to Isikeli and Reverend Alexia to Amar, as well as Mark. We have been preparing to come and share and engage in this way. I know there's one question that I've already seen that is in our chat box that came from Patsy, I think, which I think any one of our panelists feel free to be able to engage on, which was, what would it take for faith institutions to realize and understand that it has and it's hurting people, and how? Maybe there's acknowledgement, there's little acknowledgement on the role that religion plays in promoting conditions of other hate and violence. Why would they come to the table when they do not accept the role they play in inciting hate? That is something that came from Patsy. And then there's another question that has been posed at all panelists. I will just take these two for now, looking at our time, and then we can engage a little bit in that. A question to all panelists: when the time comes, yes, this is the right time. And what do you think are the most effective strategies for collaborating with faith leaders and faith institutions to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights, including LGBTQI persons, SRH rights and justice? Any of the speakers, you are most welcome to just unmute yourself and get into it.
Ricky, if I may ask you, if I may jump in, there was also, I believe, our co-sponsors, our lovely co-sponsors, the delegations of Canada and Uruguay, wanted to ask some questions. I know that Carla from Uruguay had to go, and she has left a lovely comment for us all, so we really thank her. And I'm wondering whether the delegation of Canada may have a question at this stage.
Thank you for that, Simon.
Or may ask it later if now is not the time. I don't want to.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
You're able to hear me? Great. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Permanent Mission of Canada, we're pleased to be co-sponsoring today's event, and that examines the interplay between gender, sexuality, and faith, and promoting a positive narrative on inclusion while advancing human rights, including freedom of religion or belief, provides an avenue to address some drivers of gender inequality by tackling social marginalization of individuals and communities. I have two questions for the panelists. The first is, how can government actors better promote gender-inclusive interpretations of the right to freedom of religion or belief while remaining culturally sensitive? And the second is, what are some best practices to encourage collaboration between civil society actors advocating for gender equality and faith-based actors to promote the human rights of LGBTI persons, and more specifically, their freedom of religion or belief? Thank you very much to today's panelists and for again including us a part of today's event.
Thank you so much for that, Cindy. Any other questions from our other co-sponsors? Okay. If it does come through, just please, you can even just drop it on the chat box or raise a hand. I'm monitoring that. I'm now taking back the mic back to our panelists. If anyone wishes to respond to the 3 questions that have already been placed, please just unmute yourself and go ahead.
I think I'll take the question from Patsy Ricky.
Thank you so much, Liz.
So I think it's a very complex question, right? And there's no, I think, one answer or quick answer and a quick solution to the issue. And it's really around multiple interventions that would be required in order to get a seat at the table, to get the conversation going, and then of course being able to get to a space of journeying within faith institutions towards change. And I think that for me, 3 things stand out. It's really around cultivating allyship and building on that as an opportunity to drive change. The second component would really be about messaging and the type of message. And we've spoken about that at length in terms of the different interpretations that we would want to drive and be able to bring people's attention to as part of messaging. And of course, a part of counter-narrative development within faith institutions. And then I think lastly, it's really about educating and of course, journeying with communities and sensitively so to understand that it's difficult for people to shift from understanding a status quo in one particular way and then having to augment thinking. And so a lot of investment and effort would need to go into that particular type of education. And intersectional understanding could be useful in terms of outlining that ultimately oppression is oppression. We've all experienced it at one point or another in our lives, whether it has been a gendered framing, whether it's been a race framing or cultural framing, ethnicity framing, etc. And appealing to that and how it made us feel and what work needed to go into that in order to shift it from a status quo of oppression to a status quo of inclusion. I think therein lies an opportunity for us to have the conversation then with faith-based leaders, with faith-based institutions at large, and with communities on the ground that make up the base and the foundation.
Bob, eu gostaria de falar.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that. Ms. Kelly, I think you wanted to go in. You can go ahead.
May Alexia speak?
Okay, perfect. Reverend Alexia?
Okay. When we talk about government, it's hard to think in only one possibility to have support or to have dialogue from the government. One time that in the Brazilian government, for example, in your majority is accessed by the Bible Parliament. So how fundamentalist Bible Parliament? How to dialogue with the people who persecute us? How to dialogue and to compose change of this context exactly with the pastors who is in the parliament, who access the power structure to stay against us, and who dedicate the parliament life to create policies and public laws against our community, against LGBT people. So one thing I think, one thing that I want to say as Latin America and as Brazil, it's important that our bodies who bring this reclaiming of being different access the parliament. It's important to our bodies, our LGBT bodies being in the parliament, being in the government. not only to dialogue with them, but being in there, and there combat the public policies, and there in the power structures combat the laws against our lives and our bodies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexia, for that. I think that was absolutely fantastic. I'm definitely going to have to apologize to each and every one of you who's taken the time to be with us today, because I know that we are 10 minutes over the time that we had already set for ourselves. I am going to ask that we conclude it at here. This is an ongoing conversation that requires that we continuously collaborate and we network and we do that kind of cross-movement and cross-regional engagement going forward. Because as we've seen, the far right is gaining its own momentum. We've seen that the anti-gender ideology has absolutely gained momentum at a global scale, and it is important for us, those that need to be holding this very important conversations and space, to continuously do that in a very intersectional way, in a very deliberately collaborative way, so as to ensure that then we can be able to actually hold the fence and the actual line, to be able to ensure that then we can still be able to use faith, religion, and spirituality, as well as traditions and traditional values and customs, in a way that actually embraces diversity and foregrounds universal human rights and dignity for all. I want to thank as well at this point in time the Jean Sogi team for having actually convened this very side event and bringing together these incredible minds and experts who really just only opened the doorway for us to be able to do more and more of our own self-education, to do more and more of our own investigation and research, to be able to continue to see ways in which we can be able to actually turn the tide on the narrative as it is at this very point in time. I think another important thank you, very, very vital, goes to the Uruguay and the Canadian delegation that have actually co-sponsored this very side event in itself and have made sure that you actually get us to be here. So to the Uruguay delegation as well as to the Canadian delegation, thank you so much for ensuring that this important dialogue actually happens on the margins of this very session of the Human Rights Council. And I believe that this is only but the beginning of many more other engagements and such kind of platform for dialogue, and not just meaningless dialogue, but actual tangible action that we follow through, where we follow through and we hold ourselves accountable to ensuring that our words actually turn into action, and ensuring therefore that we continuously build more and more champions within faith leadership, within religious leadership, and within traditional leadership that is able to continuously work with us to be able to build a society that is built on all people included, and also ensuring they're contributing and benefiting from all its developmental goals and agenda. And with that, I would absolutely like to thank each and every one of our esteemed speakers. Reverend Alexia, thank you so much. Liberty, thank you so much. Isikeli, Mark, it's been an absolute Amar. Thank you so much for all of your contributions, because they have really created a very powerful conversation that is important at this very time, more so as we continuously are seeing ways in which we can ensure that then the impact of the changes that we've seen globally around the world is necessitated by COVID-19, we continuously are also providing for remedy to be able to ensure that then nobody is left behind, and that we all live in an Africa and a world that we want to see. With that, from myself as Ricky Ganza, I would like to thank each and every one who attended today's session, and we're hoping that this is only but the opening for more conversation to go forward and more collaborations. I will now hand us back over to Simon and the team as we now come to our conclusion. Thank you so much.
I'll simply say thank you on behalf of everyone at GIN. Thank you for Tony for stepping in at the very last minute. And we were really happy to have you at the end, Ricky, for these great concluding remarks. Thank you again to the co-sponsors, the Canadian and Uruguayan delegations. And thank you for these amazing conversations that we keep having in this space. They're crucial, they're fundamental. We see the anti-rights movement being increasingly, dominant in this space, and we keep wanting to build bridges and to keep having such inspiring conversations. Thank you for all the work you do in your various contexts, organizations. Thank you for remaining engaged with us. And we'll send you a recording of this event and we'll send you a report. And until next time, take great care, especially with this pandemic, and we hope to see you soon.